I was arrested fighting the pipeline. My credentials on fighting pipelines are pretty clear. What the government did, and I watched this very closely, Bill Morneau bought the 65-year-old pipeline for $4.5 billion. I think they're still laughing in Texas where they deposited the check. We can't get that $4.5 billion back. We bought a 65-year-old pipeline, and we committed to build a brand new pipeline. Right? Although they call it an expansion, it doesn't expand the old one physically. It's a brand new pipeline that will cost a minimum of $10 to $13 billion. We've bought an existing 65-year-old piece of infrastructure that's currently in operation. Buying it didn't create a single additional job. Building, and by the way, this idea that people have that it's somehow easy to twin it, it's a completely different pipeline, following in many places different routings. It's not an expansion of something that's already sitting there. So the idea that we're going to build a 100% for export pipeline to ship dilbit, for which we do not have evidence of any market outside the United States. It's called an expansion, but it's a second pipeline altogether that we will have to spend $10 to $13 billion to build. Canceled.
That's canceled.
Going off oil, the first oil we cancel is the Saudi oil to Eastern Canada. We replace it. It takes a while to renegotiate contracts. I know some people have said that we've called for nationalizing oil. We didn't. The first place we cancel is foreign oil, and we continue to use, on a declining basis, bitumen and the oil sands oil in Western Canada till 2030. And then, so that gives us 10 years is time to plan. As you know, I'm saying we should be using the Canadian market and stopping imports, because while we're having this bitter dispute over sending 590,000, that's the daily barrels a day for Trans Mountain expansions, 590,000 barrels of diluted bitumen a day. We're importing into Eastern Canada 700,000 barrels of Venezuelan and Saudi oil. So crunching the numbers, which we've been doing, and we'll have many more details in our platform, crunching the numbers as we decline like this quite steeply, we should be also looking at not exporting bitumen for burning in other countries. Ideally, we shift bitumen from being used as fuel to being used as feedstock to petrochemical production, so we're not burning it at all. Sorry. Okay, let's go back to this. At the end of May, Bill Morneau committed to buying a $4.5 billion pipeline. You can't run as a liberal and say, I'm against the pipeline, and have credibility anymore. I'm sad to say it, but buying the Trans Mountain pipeline and committing public dollars in the $10 billion plus, it will probably go above the current estimate. It will be at least $13 billion of public money to build a pipeline to boost greenhouse gases when you say at the same time you're going to get to carbon neutrality by 2050. That's infrastructure that lasts 35 years minimum. You can't do it. Well, it boggles belief that no one has actually noticed the following things about the proposed project. Number one, there has never been an independent economic analysis of this project that says it's in our interest. The claims that have been made by various proponents, such as the report from Scotiabank that claimed we were losing multiple millions of dollars a day, a figure that keeps being amplified and exaggerated, was blown apart within 24 hours by economist Robin Allen from British Columbia. The claim that there is a large loss on every barrel of bitumen exported is false. It's very easy to establish, as Robin Allen did, that the big producers, Suncor, Husky, other producers out of Alberta, are upgrading bitumen and selling it at a premium. As Gordon Laxer reported in a column in the Toronto Star, the total amount of profits from the big five producers in Alberta exceeds the total government revenue for the province of Alberta. They are not suffering, they are not hurting. You cannot make any money in the oil sands unless oil is selling at more than $90 a barrel, which it's not. The economic case for Kinder Morgan, by the way, going into the National Energy Board hearings, and I was an intervener there, the economic case for Kinder Morgan was that it would hurt jobs and would be bad for Canada, because the only economic argument that was proffered by any intervener came from Unifor. Unifor argued that the project was a threat to jobs. the National Energy Board refused to hear Unifor's evidence because the National Energy Board ruled that jobs in the economy were not on the list of issues they had to study. The entire nonsense of claiming this project was in the national interest, even when it was a private sector project, was motivated by Justin Trudeau's PMO in a desperate bid to try to keep Jason Kenney out of office. They thought a pipeline would help Rachel Notley get reelected. They ran up against, of course, what was very clear from the moment they started pushing the pipeline, that there would be court challenges. And at the point that Canadians bought the pipeline, there was hanging over the project a very large question mark because we were awaiting the decision of the Federal Court of Appeal in May. In late August, as we all know, the Federal Court of Appeal quashed the permits. Now we have an unbelievable situation. The federal government is about to give, on June 18th, we are to be told, most likely, that this project is now approved. And that the people of Canada will spend another $10 to $13 billion additionally to push a pipeline through British Columbia territories where Indigenous peoples, the government of BC, most major municipalities do not want to see a pipeline loaded with dilbit, a substance that can't be cleaned up, crossing 800 watercourses between the Alberta-BC border and the Port of Vancouver. Further misinformation you've all been fed is that there's somehow a market in Asia. There isn't. The Asian market can't process bitumen any more than, by the way, can the refinery in St. John, New Brunswick. All of the same vocabulary that I've used to describe the case for Kinder Morgan applies to the case for Energy East. Neither project made any economic sense. The proponent private sector companies withdrew. And Canada, our government, must not spend money to push the project through. One last point on Indigenous consultations. The adequacy of Indigenous consultations is in the hand of SNC-Lavalin's lawyer, and SNC-Lavalin stands to have contracts in the project if it goes ahead. I think that conflict of interest is extraordinary. And in the time remaining for opening statements, I'm turning the microphone over to
more minutes, so I'm going to do a few more, if that's okay. What happens to TMX, the pipeline that we all now own? Do you sell it? Do you lose the $4.5 billion? What happens to it?
There's two different issues here, yeah. Rosemary. The first is the pipeline we bought, the $4.5 billion 65-year-old pipeline. That is a business in operation, and no one thinks that we've got a good deal there. The $4.5 billion is gone.
But you're not going to sell that. You're going to keep it because we already own it.
No one's going to buy it. I mean, it's $4.5 billion. Kinder Morgan spent $500 million for it. We're not shrewd businessmen here, Mr. Bill Morneau. Not so smart. So we've got $4.5 billion. They're still laughing in Texas. It's gone. Now the Trans Mountain pipeline owned by the people of Canada, since Kinder Morgan took $4.5 billion and laughed their way all the way back to Texas. It was built, as we know, in the late 1950s, early 60s. It was called the Trans Mountain Pipeline. It was purchased by a company whose original name was Enron Pipelines Limited. They changed their name to Kinder Morgan when Richard Kinder was one of the last surviving executives of Enron. Lucky for Richard Kinder, he didn't become the CEO of Enron, as he almost did. Jeffrey Skillings became CEO, so he went to jail, and Richard Kinder ended up taking Richard Kinder took Enron Pipelines Limited and began building it out, renaming it Kinder Morgan. One of the pipelines he bought was the one that had been built with public money in Canada 60 years ago, called Trans Mountain. Kinder Morgan had the idea of building a second pipeline solely for the purpose of bitumen export. It's all going to California. So the difference is you get Trans Mountain pipeline expansion built, you'll be getting tankers going to the U.S. We already have pipelines going to the U.S. We also have pipelines, by the way. One pipeline that Kinder Morgan didn't sell us for $4.5 billion, it's kind of funny. They kept something called the Cochin pipeline, C-O-C-H-I-N, that runs from the Dakotas up to Alberta to sell us the diluent to mix into the bitumen to make a solid substance bitumen flow through a pipeline. And that's what, it's the mixture of the diluent and the bitumen together that makes it a substance you can't clean up. But there isn't a market in Asia. And if we want to create a market in Asia, what we're doing is increasing greenhouse gases in Canada and in Asia, and violating and destroying the one opportunity we have. Again, I want to repeat this. We've got a window.
The current target of the Liberals is the same one left behind by Stephen Harper. Obviously, Scheer's is worse, and Jagmeet Singh's isn't any better. So where we end up being is we have a chance to ensure our kids have a livable world.
And of course, it's going down quite rapidly, because to hit our target, which is what science requires, is 60% below 2005 levels by 2030, which is double the target Stephen Harper set, and Justin Trudeau has kept the same target that Stephen Harper put in place, which is half of what needs to be done. So moving quickly off fossil fuels, and in this time frame, 10 years is quick. I've had people say that takes too long, but we want to make sure that there's time for the transferable skills to move into new industries. There's no reason to think that those will not be at a level that makes sure people can meet their mortgages, live their lives. There are other things that make life more affordable on our platform, like pharmacare, like childcare. These are also of benefit to people in Alberta. So I think as you look at the whole picture, this is a plan that works for every worker and family. That is our goal. Now, the second part you asked was, I'm trying to remember. That second pipeline was the one Justin Trudeau said could never be approved because of the flawed process to which it had been subjected in evaluation. This raised many issues throughout this hearing of procedural fairness, and I think those arguments are serious. Procedural fairness was not observed in denying oral cross-examination, for example. Then they approved it. Then Kinder Morgan didn't begin even trying to fundraise for that project until after they got the permits. I could go deeper to prove this whole thing was a scam, but I'll answer your question. We're stuck with owning a 65-year-old pipeline. We will never get the $4.5 billion back, and where Bill Morneau found that money was in what's called a non-budgetary transaction. In other words, they say the cash we have here in the Government of Canada is an asset. We've now converted it to an asset called a pipeline. So there was no budgetary allocation ever. Now the $10 to $13 billion additional is a public project owned by the people of Canada. So as the Government of Canada, we will pull the plug on wasting a single additional nickel on the incredibly inane, poorly researched decision to buy a pipeline that couldn't pass muster in the free market and completely violates our climate goals. Then we'll have the $10 to $13 billion for a different non-budgetary transaction, working to establish a Canadian grid strategy to get renewable, decarbonized electricity from one part of this country to the other, including to Nunavut and the Northwest Territories.
That's why we start with banning the importation of fossil fuels from other countries, so that within Canada we give workers at least this 5 to 10 years before we're out of the oil sands, right?
So nuclear actually is not necessary at all to meet our rapid trajectory off fossil fuels to a green, 100% decarbonized electricity grid, the conversion of our vehicle fleet to electric, or we don't prescribe technologies. If fuel cells and hydrogen overtake EVs in the marketplace, that would be great too. But we need to tell the market very clearly, we will not be selling internal combustion engines in this country by 2030, so plan for that. And we really need to work hard to get EV manufacturing in our auto sector so that we're competitive with the world and we're not just buying electric vehicles from other countries. But anyway, in a nutshell, nuclear isn't an answer. In other countries, the countries that have already achieved Kyoto targets and gone beyond, Scotland is at 40% below 1990 levels by 2020. Here we are in 2019, a country that pledged to go below 6% by 2012. We're far above 1990 levels. The European Union as a whole is well below 1990 levels. In Canada, we have been talking a good game, depending on who's in office, talk a good game, and either do very little or do nothing. Stephen Harper did damage, no question. And frankly, Justin Trudeau's current climate policy appears to be, we're not as bad as Conservatives. That's not climate policy.
On top of that, we really need to renegotiate the World Trade Organization and make it an organization that promotes climate action. We need a World Trade and Climate Organization. We need to support the rule of law and human rights around the world because we are world leaders.
Ms. May, thank you. Again, the question, how would you as Prime Minister protect Canadian interests and values on this changing world stage?
Well, in terms of the Paris Agreement, unfortunately, it doesn't have any penalty clauses. The last global environmental agreement that had effective sanctions was the Montreal Protocol in 1987 to protect the ozone layer, and it worked. I think it's time to go back and take out of the toolkit the sanctions and the enforcement mechanisms that were used in 1987 in Montreal, and that means trade sanctions, which means that I think the World Trade Organization needs to be reconfigured as a World Trade and Climate Organization and stop having trade agreements and trade negotiators pressure environment ministers and say, are you environmental treaties getting in the way of trade? We need to ask the question, are trade agreements getting in the way of survival? We have to, our plan, Mission Possible, calls for decarbonizing our electricity grid and expanding it rapidly so that every part of Canada we be able to sell from one province to the other, that the grid itself would be 100% renewable energy. This is a key step in the deep decarbonization of our economy. So burning coal is one of the first things to go. And mining coal as well. Now, the task force on coal sector workers has already gone out, met with the communities, met with the workers, and Nova Scotia should be able to rely on 100% renewable energy from, for instance, Hydro-Quebec. Right now, there's a pinch point. Hydro-Quebec's power gets as far as Moncton. And it's not actually a physical pinch point as far as I can understand. It's just been historically that we haven't accessed Hydro-Quebec. There's a lot of renewable energy available to each part of Canada from another part of Canada once we get the grid system working properly. Starts with recognizing that we're going off fossil fuels. New Brunswick is very well placed for, because if the economy, as David Kuhn often says, given the size of this economy, we can innovate here. We can prove things here. The economy here should not be obviously dependent on fossil fuels. One key piece of our economic transition is an investment in a Canadian grid strategy, an electricity grid coast to coast to coast with 100% renewable sources of electricity. The jobs in New Brunswick that will be made possible by our plan, Mission Possible, are particularly for carpenters, electricians, and plumbers in a massive retrofit program for every building. At the same time, we know that sustainable local economies are grown by small business. And we have to pull together as a country so that people in Alberta don't think this is about us not caring about their jobs. It's about us and everyone together caring about our children's future. And Alberta has plenty of economic opportunities in renewable energy since it is, as I've mentioned, has the best potential of any province in Canada for solar energy. And we need to, and at the point about the economy and the importance of fossil fuels to our economy, that's a critical point, and that's why we need to point to the economic opportunities that are enormous in our oil companies shifting their business plan to energy companies, and a lot of them are there. I mean, they've got the plans. They're ready to go. They're not unaware in the major big oil. I mean, some big oil has been much more responsible than others. I wouldn't paint them all with the same brush. There's the companies like ExxonMobil that spend a lot of money to lie to people. And there's companies like Royal Dutch Shell that said, okay, we better have a hydrogen division. We better get going with solar. We better be thinking about this. There's a reason that Royal Dutch Shell pulled out of the tar sands and the oil sands. I call them oil sands. It's stranded. It's stranded asset. It's unburnable carbon. So when, ConocoPhillips, Royal Dutch Shell, Total SA, the exodus away from the oil sands is not because these companies saw the light around climate change. They're looking at the reality that they do not want to be invested in oil sands when it becomes clear that that is a liability and they don't want stranded assets. It always gets reported in the business pages in Canada, by the way, great opportunity for Canadian businesses to buy into the oil sands. There's a reason the largest transnationals are leaving. It's not economical. And we need to stop sinking public funds into a loser economically, like a Trans Mountain Pipeline. And it's going to be profitable. There's also work to be done in cleaning up the oil sands. I mentioned in an earlier speech in this room, the new toxic waste site that eclipses all others is the oil sands and the tailings ponds. And the liabilities are with the companies that created that mess. But if history is any guide, taxpayers will be left with that mess. But let's get the companies, while they're still operating, to start cleaning up the mess and rehabilitating the areas that have had ecological destruction in producing bitumen. They made the promise to clean it up, but we know that the funds that have been set aside are woefully inadequate. I'm disappointed in what the Liberals announced today. It clearly shows that they're hearing the voices of our own children on the streets, but they're not serious. A commitment to get to carbon neutrality by 2050 is good, but they're putting a promise out there for 30 years from now. I need to know what they're going to do in 2 years, in 18 months. I need to know what they're going to do by 2025, because their current target, and I want to be very clear about this, the current target that the Liberals are holding to makes it impossible for them to keep this new promise. You can't set a goal at 2050 of carbon neutrality and only be 30% below 2005 levels by 2030, which is their current target. It's the Stephen Harper target. They have yet to put a plan in place to hit that target. If I were Prime Minister, the first thing to do is to actually sit down and develop an energy strategy so that we think like a country. And in that energy strategy, climate targets are boss. You can't negotiate with the atmosphere. We're not going to get a better deal from planetary atmospheric chemistry and physics than we're getting right now, which is to say, humanity, you have one chance only to hold to 1.5 degrees Celsius. The window on that opportunity is closing and will have closed before the next election. We have to make the transition choices now. It will take till 2030 to achieve them, and then to 2050 to go completely off fossil fuels. But to sit down with Albertans and say, okay, let's make sure this works for you. And that's why in Mission Possible we call for saying while we're transitioning off, and it's a very dramatic downward movement, because we actually say for Canada we need 60% reductions below 2005 levels by 2030. That would allow continuing working, and we're also going to have to spend a lot of money to clean up the mess left behind by the oil sands. That will keep oil sands workers also busy for quite a while. We have orphaned deep oil wells, hundreds of them throughout BC and Alberta.
Tens of thousands.
Tens of thousands, yes, thank you. Tens of thousands of abandoned oil wells, but quite a good number of them can be converted into geothermal electricity production.
It can't stay the way it is, I don't think, with your plan. So what do they need to be okay with giving up?
Our plan doesn't ask people to give up anything. It asks people to be engaged in a more meaningful connection to government as citizens of a country where they're in charge.
But you've just said you want to get rid of fossil fuels.
That's right.
You've doubled the targets that the Liberals have in place to reach by 2030. I don't see how you do those things without some discomfort.
The discomfort is far more severe if we ignore the climate crisis.
I give you that, but what is the discomfort that your plan would create for Canadians?
I don't see it as discomfort to plug in your car instead of going to a gas station. We are not asking individual Canadians to take on a cost. We're asking the federal government to show the kind of leadership that existed in the 80s. You know, when we decided to protect the ozone layer in this country, which Canada did in the lead, we didn't say, gee, are people prepared to pay more if we lose the propellants in the hairspray that we use? No one actually noticed the difference when we got rid of chlorofluorocarbons. Fossil fuels are more difficult, and we need to make sure every worker in the fossil fuel sector knows that their skills are transferable, and we need all those skills. But the cost to this society of holding to the current target, which is completely inconsistent with global survival. He has to say, I'm running as a Liberal, but I'm against the pipeline. So there's a certain amount of cognitive dissonance going on. I always think whenever I hear Catherine McKenna say the environment and the economy go hand in hand, the image that now pops into my mind of the hand in hand is Thelma and Louise at the end of the film. We're heading for a cliff, and hand in hand with the Liberals, we'll go off the edge. Je suis disponible pour les questions, anglais ou français, and thank you all for being here. Jenica, come back up here and stand with me. I'd like all the Green Party federal candidates, come on up here. We've got Tim, Rowan, who else is here?
Tim Thompson from Fundy Royal, Susan Jonah from New Brunswick. There you are, Susan. New Brunswick Southwest. And also Rowan Miller, Tobic Mactaquac. Have I missed any candidates? Anyway, stick with me. And don't look bored like behind all those other leaders.